Tough times breed tough men, and confusing times often breed confusing men. Tricksy times sometimes produce tricksy guys, and as anyone who's ever fallen for a scam will tell you, there are few things on earth as dangerous as a con man with a convincing persona and a well-structured PowerPoint and free pens. Some grifters only work on a small scale, committing a little light fraud here and there, whilst others bring entire countries to their knees, often without any consequence at all. One such unsavoury character was Aristagoras of Miletus. He had been born around 540 BCE and was the son of one of the city's most powerful men. His father was possibly even tyrant of the city when it was conquered by Cyrus the Great of Persia. The Persians as a people from around 545 to 522 had been going a little crazy with the expansion, and had successfully brought the ever-warring Ionians under their fairly loose rule. Here's how they would do it. So they would remove the leader of any city who opposed them, and replace them with locals who were loyal to the great king. By doing this, they'd avoid pissing off the xenophobic Greeks by appearing to be foreign dictators, but they wouldn't tolerate anything too unpredictable. The Persians were a people who saw their own king as infallible and thought the Greeks would feel the same way about their leaders, but even a cursory glance at Greek history would prove that they did not share this custom. The Greeks had a bizarre cultural suspicion of individuals with too much power or authority. Even in cities like Sparta, their kings were thoroughly grilled and criticized. Athens was on the verge of founding a democracy, and the idea amongst Greeks generally at this time was that the old model of aristocratic oligarchy or tyranny was no longer a desirable form of government. This is something that the great king simply could not tolerate. Democracies were wild and unpredictable things that followed the will of an emotional and short-sighted lower class. Instead, the king stood behind the absolute autocracies of men who remained loyal to their Persian masters. No matter how much popular outrage might shake the tyranny, the immense resources of the Persian Empire would always keep them propped up. This is unideal for most Ionians, but not for the star of our tale. Miletus, the city of Aristagoras' birth, was doing very well out of the Persian hegemony. They had surrendered to Persia early on and supported them throughout their conquest of Asia Minor, meaning they had a nice little favourable spot, and whenever anyone messed with them, like Polycrates of Samos for example, Big Daddy Persia would come and sort that out in no time. The position of importance is something that Miletus maintains all the way up till 513 BCE when the great king asks him a favour. You see, Darius, the king of all four corners of the world, is having trouble in the northwest corner. The Scythian nomads had thrown shade his way, and he needed to do the whole great king thing of kicking the horse people around for 4 months to remind them who's boss. The trouble is, in order to do this, the whole Persian army needed to run a supply train through Ionia, across a bridge over the Hellespont, and up through the Balkans. The tyrant of Miletus, who was the uncle of Aristagoras, one Histiaeus, is put in charge of guarding the bridge of supplies. Whilst guarding the bridge, he gets into a conversation with an Athenian man called Miltiades. Although from Athens originally, Miltiades was currently tyrant of his own little city in the north of Greece, and his political views didn't really jive with everyone else's. He was about as anti-Persian as they came, and despite how unpopular that made him at dinner, he would not stop talking about how if they would all just agree to burn the bridge between Asia and Europe, the great king would be trapped for the winter on the Ukrainian steppe. This would wipe him and his entire army out and probably lead to the collapse of his empire, liberating all of the Ionian Greeks from his rule. Given that his company at the time was made up of those who were only in power because of their loyalty to Persia, this was not really the best audience to pitch treason to, so Miltiades quickly fled before Darius returned and somebody could snitch on him. Regardless of his loyalty, however, Histiaeus is a little bit too bold in his requests from the great king for his city. Growing suspicious of these fickle Greeks, King Darius thinks of a perfect solution. He keeps his friends close and his enemies closer, and he decides to promote Histiaeus away from where he was most dangerous and make him the personal advisor to the king. This new position would force the tyrant to leave his power base in Miletus in the hands of his nephew, and accompany the great king all the way back to Susa and the main court of the empire. So the stage is set. Despite his loyalty, Histiaeus is transported away from his home, and Miletus, the leader of the Ionian cities under Persian rule, is left in the hands of our devious friend Aristagoras. Aristagoras is a charming and persuasive man, but he's not really a very lucky or smart one, and his ascension to power is going to be the beginning of a horrific downward spiral for the Ionians, and it all starts with a little island called Naxos. I say little. Naxos was a giant of Aegean trade in the 6th century BCE, but the city had been through a fair bit of civil strife over the last few decades. In 500 BCE, some aristocrats who had been overthrown in a previous coup came as refugees to Miletus, and addressed Aristagoras with a request. If he and the Milesians would help the exiles take Naxos back, then Aristagoras would have nominal control over the island. Ever ambitious, the tyrant obviously loves this idea, but there's one problem though. Miletus' military was not much to boast about. Maintaining a large fighting force right next to Persia was not really encouraged by the Great King. He didn't like his subjects to have large personal armies for obvious reasons. Naxos, however, was outside of the Persian sphere of influence, and could easily field 8,000 fighting men and a large navy. On top of that, the island was essentially a fortress, and with adequate preparations, they could hold out a besieging force for months on end. So the element of surprise would be absolutely crucial. With this in mind, Aristagoras goes to Sardis. Sardis was the seat of the Persian satrap of Lydia, essentially the boss of everyone in the west of the Persian Empire. His name was Artaphernes, and he was the king's own paternal half-brother, so convincing this guy was a big deal. So Aristagoras would pull the big guns out. He says, "Look at the little islands here that don't belong to you yet." Yet being the key word here. This little speck here, for example, this is Naxos. Now, it may not look like much, but let me tell you, the soil here is super fertile, fertile enough to sustain a large population of slaves, that is, which is what they'll be once you've conquered the island. And then once it's yours, why not take a trip to Paros, just next door, and get some of the finest marble in the world? Oh look, it's Andros, we could just swipe that up in no time. And once all these valuable little diamonds in the sea are yours, why not use them as a springboard for an invasion of Euboea? This sexy little bastard could be all yours. Look at it. It's basically just Cyprus, only rotated 90 degrees. And I'm sure you remember how much money Cyprus made you when you conquered that. Artaphernes is impressed. How many men do you reckon it'll take to capture the island? Aristagoras replies that 100 ships should be sufficient to subdue the entire Aegean Sea. Oof, that's awfully expensive. But that's okay, says Aristagoras with an ill-deserved confidence. My city of Miletus can pay for the whole campaign once it's over. This is a bold-faced lie. There is no way that Miletus can pay for even a fraction of this. Aristagoras is relying on the campaign going totally smoothly, so he can capture thousands of slaves to sell and pay for his expensive conquest. The Persians are convinced, however. In fact, they double down. They prepare a fleet of 200 ships to be ready to sail by the springtime of 499 BCE. Artaphernes sends word to his brother, who of course loves the plan, but he has only one reservation. Total command cannot be given to a Greek, especially a Greek that Darius doesn't know and trust. So instead the invasion will be led by Darius's own cousin, Megabates. And so, in total secret, the combined force of Greeks, Persians, and other subject people begin building their fleet, and secrecy is maintained by strict guards and constant patrols. And this is where the problems really start. The city of Myndus, a close ally of Miletus, had provided several ships and sailors for the expedition. They are commanded by Scylax, a close personal friend of Aristagoras, who is a pretty lazy commander. Megabates, who patrolled the docks nightly to inspect the guards, found the Myndian ships without lookouts, and is furious. He has the commander dragged out of bed and then jammed into an ore hole, like he's there to plug a leak or something. And then he lets everyone laugh at him. This is Persian justice, and Megabates considers his job done and continues his rounds. You can imagine his shock when a furious Aristagoras comes up to him, fuming about the transgression. Aristagoras reminded Megabates that even though he was a relative of the Great King, this mission was still his idea, and that he had no right to be tying up Greeks and Miletus' allies. The argument goes on for a while, but at the end of the day, Aristagoras is paying for the mission, technically, so he has the last word. The invasion is doomed, though. Herodotus tells us that Megabates, out of pure spite, sent word to the Naxians about the coming invasion. The Naxians immediately double the size of their walls and bring all of the island's supplies and population within them. Now here is where I should probably mention that I'm ripping this narrative more or less directly from Herodotus, a writer who was born 15 years after these events. And the stereotype in his day of Ionians is one of being disorganized and ill-disciplined, and the stereotypes of Persians are that of being sneaky, subterfuge, underhanded peoples. So who knows if this story that so perfectly exemplifies both of these well-established caricatures of their respective peoples in the eyes of this foreigner is actually true. But regardless, when Aristagoras arrives at Naxos expecting to take them by surprise, he instead finds a fortress island ready for a siege. Aristagoras did not have the money or the supplies to maintain a siege, and he definitely didn't have the men or equipment to storm the fortress. So he and his Ionian/Persian friends spent about 4 months in limbo, waiting outside the walls, and eventually the ships begin to rot, and the food starts to run out, and everyone realizes they've made a mistake, and they go home. This is a problem for Aristagoras. He's basically just thrown the fire festival of naval campaigns, and he doesn't even have a fraction of the amount of money he promised his investor, Artaphernes. And on top of that, Megabates, the cousin of both Artaphernes and the great King Darius, now hated him personally. It was only a matter of time before the disappointed and resentful Persians removed him from power and probably killed him. He needed a plan. And it was at this crucial moment that a slave of his uncle, Histiaeus, having travelled all the way from Susa, rocked up in Miletus, and he carried a simple message: shave my head. Weird request, but okay, so they did shave the man and find tattooed on his scalp a message from the old tyrant urging his nephew and the whole city to rebel against the great king. Because Histiaeus had been plotting. Because, apparently, plotting is literally the only thing to do in Susa, and no amount of seeing rebels being flayed and impaled in the royal capital has managed to put this guy off of his scheming. I swear everyone in late 6th century Ionia was just Littlefinger in a bedsheet, but whatever. Histiaeus had gotten homesick whilst in Susa, and was convinced that if his home city rebelled, he, being an expert on Ionianism because, he was Ionian, would for some reason be chosen to lead the counterforce. He then hoped to turn this counterforce against Persia and make himself king of all the lands from the rising to the setting sun, which as far as we're concerned takes up about 2/3 of modern day Turkey. Or something. Herodotus is actually pretty hazy on what the plan really was here. I actually think Histiaeus is maybe just winging it a bit. Anyway, he tattooed this message to the head of a slave, and then he let his hair grow back to hide it, allowing the message to travel across half the empire without being intercepted. Aristagoras loves the idea of rebelling. It's pretty much the only thing that can keep him in power anymore, so he gathers all of his advisors to make a pros and cons list regarding the rebellion against Persia. So on the pros list, all of the usual. Greek values of autonomy and eleutheria, great power will be ours, we are the master race, etc, etc, etc. When suddenly the only person in the room with seemingly any grip on reality stands up and tells everybody what a bad idea this is. Persia is huge. These are the Ionian cities, and by every calculation possible, the Greeks are going to lose. And he's right. But everyone else ignores him and votes for rebellion for some fucking reason. So finally, we can kickstart the story of the worst idea ever. Aristagoras, the guy who's at the head of this thing, seems grimly unaware of the stupidity of what he's done. So he goes about ensuring that every city gets involved, giving this revolution a little bit of a people's flair. So he rounds up all the collaborators, the people who've made deals with the Persians and benefited from their rule, and it's worth noting that up until less than 24 hours ago, Aristagoras was part of this collaborator class, but it doesn't stop him from whipping his city into a murderous frenzy about them, and he calls for the removal of all the tyrants. As I mentioned earlier, the Greeks were uncomfortable with having a single individual in power, especially one who was unquestionable. Tyranny was an unpopular governmental type to have, and on top of that, most of the Ionian tyrants were only in power because of Persian backing. By purging the tyrants, Aristagoras had pulled a propaganda double whammy. He was simultaneously appealing to those who hated the tyrants, and those who hated the overall rule of the Persians. Interestingly though, the removal of these rulers was almost totally bloodless. All of the tyrants were allowed to leave with their lives and their families intact. All with the exception of Mytilene, who resented their tyrants so much that they stoned him to death. Aristagoras, realizing the utter hypocrisy of ordering an end to tyranny while he himself remained in power as a tyrant, stepped down from the position. This was purely symbolic, but it also established early on the nature of this new Ionian confederacy. Aristagoras did not take overall command of the Ionian rebels. Although he was the closest to an overall leader they would ever really have, he was more simply the leader of the military council of Miletus, one of 12 separate military councils for each of the 12 Ionian cities. Also, all these other places were involved and they'd all command themselves as well, so the rebellion, though widespread, was deeply divided and would never establish any central leadership, instead functioning more like 20 separate rebellions than one big one. Aristagoras knows that his odds are bad even before he thinks too hard about how internally divided his own army is, and he decides he needs to go and use his powers of persuasion to get some powerful allies on side. So he goes to Sparta first of all. Usually the Spartans pursue a policy of isolationism, never really venturing beyond the Peloponnese. But the king of Sparta right now is Cleomenes, who's kind of like the FDR of Sparta, and he's already invaded Attica a few times to try and stunt the establishment of democracy. He'd overthrown Lygdamis of Naxos, and most importantly, he had a unique concern about the Persian Empire's slow march westwards towards Greece. Aristagoras thought that surely bringing this adventurous and warlike Spartan to his cause would be easy. The Spartans would remember the meeting between the two, and recall it to Herodotus a few decades later. Apparently, Aristagoras did not hold back at all. Firstly, no convincing argument can be made without visual aids, and so he brings with him a huge bronze plate with a map of the world engraved into it. He uses this map to show Cleomenes all the lands that would be his if only he defeated Persia. Here is Lydia, rich in gold and silver, then Phrygia, which had many flocks of animals, then the Armenians, Cappadocians, Cilicians, all of whom pay tribute to the great king, until finally you reach Susa, the imperial centre of the empire, where the great king himself with all of his treasure resided. Capture Susa, says Aristagoras, and you will capture the world. Mastery of Asia, possession of gold and silver to rival Zeus himself, power over peoples more numerous than any Greek state. All of this, Aristagoras could not help but point out, was grander in every way to the rocky strip of lands that the Spartans currently occupied, wasting their great talents as warriors on the Argives and Arcadians, who had no gold or silver to give them once defeated. Boldly, Aristagoras even shames the Spartan king. How is it that he isn't involved already? The sons of Ionia are slaves, and the champions of Greece, Sparta, have stood by and done nothing. Surely the greatest warriors in the world should have stood up for their kinsmen in Asia. Besides, it's not as if the Spartans are going to struggle to defeat the Persians. Aristagoras paints this picture of a Persian soldier as dressed in trousers, wearing funny hats, and fighting with short spears and bows. And yet somehow, these cowardly Persians had acquired an insane amount of wealth, just waiting for the first Greeks to realize how easy it would be to take it from them. Cleomenes seems unmoved. He has just one question for the rebel. How many days' journey from the Ionian coast is it to the Persian capital at Susa? Herodotus points out that this is where Aristagoras really screws up. He is honest about the time of travel, and he tells Cleomenes that it takes him 3 months. Before he can say anything else, Cleomenes cuts him off, and he orders him to leave Sparta by sunset, and then goes home. Totally taken aback by the abruptness of his dismissal, Aristagoras boldly follows the king home, trying to convince him. Cleomenes, being oddly polite, allows Aristagoras to enter his house and carry on talking. He offers money to the Spartans up front for helping, and when this offer is refused, he offers more, and the bribe continues to grow in size until Aristagoras is essentially willing to bankrupt himself to get the Spartans on side. Cleomenes looks almost interested to reopen negotiations, when his 9-year-old daughter comes in and demands his attention. "Father," she says, "your visitor is going to corrupt you." This brings Cleomenes back to his senses after being briefly blinded by the money, and the king is pleased that his daughter was already at such a young age an incorruptible little Spartan, and follows her into another room without even saying goodbye to Aristagoras. Okay, so no Spartan help was coming. That wasn't good. But there were other cities in Greece. Athens, for example, was a nice populous state filled with experienced soldiers from fighting all those recent civil battles. Those civil battles, by the way, had led to the foundation of democracy about 7 years prior, so instead of convincing a single king, Aristagoras now found himself in front of a 6,000-strong crowd. They haven't really been doing democracy very long either, so they aren't really 100% on what they're supposed to be doing, so no one really knows how this is going to go. Aristagoras gives the Athenians the same speech he gave Cleomenes, with the exception that this time, he would really emphasize the brotherhood of Ionians, of which Athens was merely the most westerly of the siblings. Miletus itself was even supposedly founded by colonists from Athens way back when, and this bonded both of the cities. The response to this is overwhelmingly positive. The crowd goes wild. They're cheering and things, presumably, I don't know. All Herodotus says is that Aristagoras won them over, before cynically stating that it is easier to con a crowd than it is to con an individual. The Athenians promised to send one of their best commanders, Melanthius, along with 20 ships to help. 20 ships, by the way, is fucking nothing. The Persian Navy is several hundred ships strong at its weakest. 20 ships isn't even bringing like a knife to a gunfight, it's straight up bringing a spork to Verdun. It's the interstate alliance version of seeing your friend being attacked by a bear and being like, "Don't worry bro, I'll be here sneezing on the bear." Not only is that not only going to stop the bear from tearing your friend apart like a discarded cornetto wrapper, but it also means that once Miletus is dead, the bear is going to turn its attention to the ineffective, but still irritating Sneezer. Anyways, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Basically, the Athenians have sent too few men to win the war, but just enough to get a mention under the belligerents section in Wikipedia. They're also accompanied by 5 Eritrean ships who were there repaying a debt of honour to the Milesians from a few years earlier. Having removed the traitors, gathered the allies, and landed in Asia, the rebels are ready to move against Persia. They start at Ephesus, where they're guided by loyal locals across the mountains to the plains on which Sardis lay. Sardis, which was the imperial capital of Lydia, and now the centre of Persian power in the Western Empire, and it lay almost completely undefended. Artaphernes had not taken the reports of rebellion seriously, and certainly didn't expect an army of rebels to appear so soon at his capital. Before he knew it though, the Greeks were pouring into the city. Without great leadership, they began just indiscriminately looting. Artaphernes didn't have the men to stop them, however. In fact, he didn't even have the men to try and defend the city. He only had a small guard of retainers from Persia and a few loyal Lydian soldiers, only a couple of hundred of them. He kept them on the hill of the Acropolis where they could easily defend themselves and prevent being outflanked. But soon enough though, one of the Greeks lights a fire near one of the reed houses. Even the buildings in Sardis that are brick still have reed thatched roofs, and the city goes up in flames in no time. The only safety is the river, open space and a body of water being the only shelter from the growing blaze. Artaphernes, seeing the flames race towards him, knows that it's all over. He can either allow himself to be consumed in fire, or he can fight, and he decides that if he is to die, he might as well die a soldier. The satrap leads his small band of Persians and Lydians to the town square, where they're going to make their final stand. Fully believing that they would die, outnumbered as heavily as they were, the Persians fought like men possessed. But the Greeks, who were firmly settled into the mindset of "we have won," were not keen to die in large numbers now, trying to kill this band of suicidally brave guards. To be frank with you, the Greeks weren't really following any rhyme or reason here. They just seemed to be looting for its own sake, so instead of killing or capturing the king's half-brother, the Ionians just leave. But Sardis is completely wrecked, burned utterly to the ground. The great temple of Cybele, famous throughout Anatolia, has been completely destroyed. Persian reinforcements arrive expecting to find no survivors. Instead they find the burned down capital, but a vengeful satrap standing on the ashes. Okay, let's speed through what happens next, because it is a long, complicated war. Artaphernes catches up with the rebels using his cavalry. He then beats them in battle outside Ephesus, demoralizing the Athenians and Erythraeans so much that they actually just straight up pack it in and go home. The rebels take the Hellespont, but the Persians take it back. The Persians then attack both Ionia and Caria at the same time. In Ionia, they basically just capture city after city. Caria is where the real action is, though. The Persians crush the rebels at two major battles, effectively breaking their ability to punch into Persian territory. But before they can secure their victory, they're ambushed by a ragtag group of Carians and beaten. This slows the Persian conquest massively, but long story short, the empire is now committing so much time and so many resources on this rebellion that the Greeks no longer stand any chance of winning. And that brings us to Lade. In 494, everyone was ready for the depressing conclusion to this depressing episode in their history. The Persians had regrouped under the Median general Darius, who everyone knew loved to kill Greeks, and the rebel leadership had collapsed, as had many of their alliances. The Persian Navy was now distraction-free and involved fully, and their army was slowly marching towards the heart of the rebellion and the city that had started this whole mess, Miletus. The remaining rebels knew their situation was dire, and that they'd have to strike a hell of a blow to the Persians to secure their own safety for another year or so. They decided that fighting Darius's huge horde of horsemen was not an option. The Milesians would just have to rely on their walls to defend them from the land. Instead, they would strike at the Persian Navy. They still had 350 ships after all, mostly from Chios, Lesbos, Samos, and of course Miletus. The Persians, on the other hand, bore down on the Greeks with 600 ships. Phoenicians, Cypriots, Egyptians, representatives from all the great maritime satrapies of the empire. Scared senseless, the Ionians turned to one Dionysius of Phocia. Although he only commanded 3 ships, Dionysius was the most experienced naval commander of the bunch, and a determined rebel. When news of the Persian armada reached the Greeks, it's Dionysius that steps up to steel their nerves. He tells them that their affairs are balanced on a razor's edge, and that they will decide here whether or not to live as slaves to Persia or as free Greeks. He then gives the whole blood, sweat and tears spiel, telling the Ionians that if they endured hardship for a few months, they might earn their freedom forever. Although this was initially met with cheers, the mood would quickly change. Dionysius began a strict training regiment. The Phoenicians, that made up the bulk of the Persian navy, had been on the sea since they were children. The rowers for a Phoenician trireme had developed immense muscles in areas that the Greeks had never even worked before. Anyone who doesn't exercise will tell you that trying to start sucks, because your body is just not used to it. Suddenly, forgetting entirely what would happen if the Persians won the ensuing battle, the Ionians revolt against their admiral, and refuse to get back on their ships. When Dionysius tries to enforce discipline, it's pointed out to him that he only commands 3 ships, and he can't actually force people to do what he says. His speech about fight against slavery is then turned against him by unhappy sailors and marines, complaining that having to train every day was basically slavery anyway, so what's the point? Dionysius never gives up though. Even though most of his navy won't listen to him, he continues to drill the ones that do. This makes the other Ionians very nervous, however. Persian messengers were starting to appear in the camp. Remember those exiles from the beginning of the revolt? The ones who Aristagoras had kicked out for being pro-Persian? Well, they're back and they're here with the invading fleet. These exiles would then send messages into the Ionian camp, telling anyone who would listen that when the Persians won the battle, and they would win the battle, anyone who deserted and switched sides would be given favour under the new regime. Although very few took them up on the offer immediately, the seed had been planted. Herodotus tells us that when the Persians arrived, those ships left to the Ionians attacked them. And what happens next is massively confused by the later sources. Herodotus tells us that he's told a different story by everyone, depending on who they want to blame. The Samians blame the Chians blame the Mytileneans, who probably blame the people from Teos, etc. Basically, everyone is pointing fingers about what happens next. Because as soon as the actual fighting starts, it becomes clear that those offers of clemency from the Persians were actually very appealing to the Ionians. Of the 60 Samian ships that took part in the battle, for example, all but 11 of them would defect. The 11 that stayed to fight obviously died, but by Herodotus' time, the betrayal of the Samians had become an event remembered shamefully by the people of the island. As a result, they erect a column in their town centre with the names of all the sailors who had stayed to fight inscribed on it, honouring them. At the time, the Samian defection had essentially broken the Greek line. The fleet from Lesbos, a full 70 ships, all turned tail when they saw the Samians do the same. Soon, everyone other than the fleet from Chios had run. The contingent from Chios, made up of 100 ships, each with 40 crew, fought until they risked being utterly surrounded and destroyed. The Chian survivors sailed to Mycale, where they beached their ships and decided the only safe escape was to trek back to Chios via land. This would take them through the territory of their allies, the Ephesians. However, the people of Ephesus were given no prior warning that a few hundred beaten-up marines would come staggering through their lands. Believing them to be a group of raiders, and not stopping to ask any questions, the Ephesians fell on their allies and wiped them out. This was the Battle of Lade, and it marks the end of the Ionian revolt. Miletus falls and is thoroughly sacked. The men are all killed and the women and children are sold into slavery. The greatest Greek city on Asia Minor, the titan of colonization and trade, the birthplace of Greek philosophy, would never fully recover from being utterly flattened. So let's take a minute to find out what happened to the rest of our characters. Aristagoras sees the rebellion going south before the Battle of Lade even happens, and that's why he disappears after Sardis. He goes to try and set up a colony in Thrace where the Persians couldn't reach him, and the Persians couldn't get him there, but the locals could, and after a few months he dies in a raid of his unsuccessful town. Histiaeus, the guy who encouraged all this from Susa, eventually did manage to convince Darius to send him home. But when he gets to Ionia, however, Artaphernes the satrap doesn't trust him much, so when his brief stint as a pirate gets him eventually captured, he finds himself impaled on a stick and sent back to Susa, the place that he'd always wanted to escape from. There he will rest eternally with a stick through him. Dionysius, our intrepid and brave admiral, actually does quite well at Lade and even captures 3 ships, so basically going 1 for 1. When he sees the battle go south, however, he flees along with everyone else. Dionysius will continue to raid Persian shipping as a pirate along the Levantine coast for a while, until that becomes too dangerous. He then moves to Sicily and becomes a very successful pirate lord, raiding Carthaginian shipping. Ionia returns to Persian control, although it is now much stricter because, well, of course it is. And the Athenians. Well, while this is the end of the story for the Ionians, it's really the beginning of the story for Athens. Their young and frightened little democracy is shook by the defeat, and in 493, the city's dramatic festival will show a play called The Fall of Miletus, based around the tragedy of the final episode of this revolt. This was unusual for the Greeks, who often set their fiction in the mythological past, and rarely portrayed current events. And, just as the Athenians had Persia on their mind, the Persians had the Athenians on their mind as well. Herodotus tells us that the aging King Darius, sitting on his throne at Susa, had a servant whose job it was to whisper in his ear every day, "Majesty, remember the Athenians." The great king was planning a great revenge against the mainland city who had dared to help those who rebelled against him. There is literally no happy ending here, I guess except for Dionysius, who gets to pirate around for the rest of his life. But basically the Ionian revolt is a frustratingly depressing story of people not being able to work together in the most basic of ways and suffering as a result. The Ionians never picked a leader, they never picked a strategy, or even a real purpose. Instead they simply burned Sardis and went home, allowing the Persians to defeat them one by one until they were so weak and demoralized that they fell apart. So the moral of the story is, if you're going to do something, do it properly. Also, if you're going to do something because an incredibly persuasive individual told you to, and everyone else seems to be going along with it, but you're not totally sure if it's worth the risk, maybe think a bit before deciding to hop on board.